Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be sharing a rather heartwarming and unique story about an individual who, when facing midlife as a professor of earth sciences, decided to do something about what could have been considered a midlife crisis. Simply purchasing an animal that was actually asked as a question, did you get this to ride or did you decide it's just going to be a pet? Now, this would be a pet if the decision was made that would have ears that would be up to a foot long. It was all white and fluffy and up to 700 pounds and seemed to have a mind of its own. And this particular animal also showed exactly what real-life experiences were like, as somebody finally had a life-affirming relationship, which could be rather funny at times and life-affirming, as I said. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today that very special story with our guest, Margaret Winslow, her book, Smartass, How a Donkey Challenged Me to Accept His True Nature and Rediscover My Own. Margaret, thank you for being on the program today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be invited.
I think it's kind of unique to have this story because my wife and I had decided to relocate to Arizona. And down in this state here, the one thing they do have a lot of when you're in the right areas are wild donkeys. And this is something I didn't have a whole lot of experience with. And I remember one time we were out in an area called Oatman, Arizona, which is an old mining town.
Oh, yes.
And just as you pass through it and you're going eastbound on old Route 66, we happened to encounter, I think it was 4 of them, and I think 3 were babies and 1 was a mother. And I looked off in the distance, seen them about 50 yards up to the left side of the highway, and this was a 2-lane highway. You know, in Arizona they kind of go on forever. And I stopped, and the animals decided to come and walk toward me, and what they eventually did was stand right in front of the truck. And they just kind of looked like, well, you know, we got all day here. What do you plan to do next? And so when I was reading your story, I got a real kick out of the fact that that's exactly how they are. Just that. They just kind of looked, and then finally there was a car that came up from behind, and I put my hand out the window and I rolled my hand into a fist, sort of that military signal that says stop, halt. And then I said, okay, now go ahead, and I kind of waved, but I was also, letting him know do it very slowly, and it was a guy in a Corvette with his wife, and I noticed they were in midlife. And as I waved them around, they could see exactly why, because they couldn't see him from behind the truck, because they literally were right in front of me, just standing there, And so they just kind of rolled by and smiled, and I thought, what a unique experience there. It's sort of like, what's the hurry to go anywhere? And I wasn't in any hurry, so we kind of stayed there, and of course we're filming and so forth. But my first obvious question, I'm sure you get this quite a bit, is why a donkey at the time that you decided to get one?
Okay, there were 2 strands. One is when I'm a field geologist, and I was working in the Dominican Republic in rural areas, and I started to see donkeys everywhere being used to carry water. It was the dry season, and also carrying kids to school and Papa to the bodega. And I noticed that they didn't usually have any reins or rope or halter on them, and they just seemed to know the way. And as I was working in the area very slowly on collecting rock samples, looking for evidence of prior earthquakes, I noticed that the donkeys would seemingly show up at school and pick up the kids, and they knew the way down to the water, the river, and I just became fascinated by them. And I had been horse crazy as a kid, as many are, and I took riding lessons. And at age 20, a horse ran away with me and threw me and stopped dead and threw me over his head. And I was injured, and I was very afraid. I enjoyed looking at horses from afar, but I wouldn't get near one for decades. And then I started looking at these funny horse-like things with their comical ears and their punk manes, and I just I think I took as many pictures of donkeys as I did rock exposures, and I wanted to know more about them when I got back. Joined clubs online and got magazines and went to donkey and mule shows.
Now, I know also you had a fascination and a love for donkeys that went back as far as your first discovery of one. I believe it was in a Sears catalog.
Yes, and it was only after I was working in the Dominican Republic that I remembered this, that, the Sears catalog was everybody's wish book, and the Christmas catalog would come around Thanksgiving, and we kids would all fight over it, and I'd somehow strayed from the pages for toys and clothing and found the section for live animals. And back up until the early 60s, I'm dating myself here, the Sears catalog and several others carried live farm animals. And I came across this ad for a genuine Mexican burro, and there was a little girl standing next to this shaggy pony with rabbit ears, and she was wearing a Dale Evans outfit just like I had. And the way the donkey was looking towards the camera just fascinated me, and I asked for a donkey every single year. Growing up in suburban New York, it was not possible to get one. In fact, I never actually saw a real one, a live one, until I went to the Dominican Republic. But my parents did buy me a stuffed donkey.
Now, it's really fascinating for people to come to know because, there are donkeys and there are mules. And, in fact, it wasn't until I actually read this book, and not that it was a burning question in my lifetime to find out what the difference between the two is. But let's go ahead and share that first.
Sure. I'm asked it wherever I go. A horse and a donkey are each separate species. And a horse has 64 chromosomes, a donkey has 62. But if a male donkey mates with a female horse, the offspring is called a mule, and it is sterile. So you have to have a mating for each mule. They cannot reproduce. And so anyway, the opposite cross, people always ask, is what happens when a horse stallion mates with a female donkey, the opposite way. And that produces an even more obscure hybrid called a hinny, which are very uncommon.
Now, let's talk about the circumstances when it came to actually answering an ad for a donkey to actually purchase one. Now, I know that you had done a lot of research. I mean, you read a lot of articles. And now at this time, your husband was someone who actually his career was going out to sea, so that was the time you decided to purchase your donkey. And let's talk about what actually happened there.
Okay, so he actually accompanied me to a couple of donkey and mule shows, but he's an oceanographer. We always like to say, well, he spent his whole career at sea, and I spent my whole career on land, so we had the perfect marriage. We did have a lot of separation. So he knew I was interested in donkeys, but he didn't know how close I was to wanting to buy one. And so he was off the coast of South Australia in a storm when he got my email saying I bought a donkey, and he just fell. He told me later he fell off his chair. I was so shocked. But anyway, the way I found it was the American Donkey and Mule Society magazine is called The Brayer. Great magazine, comes out of Texas, and they had an ad for a white large standard saddle donkey, and I drove up and met this donkey, and it was fascination on both sides, I think. And the owner told me that I was the fifth person to look at Caleb, who's 4 years old, and he was a he herded goats and sheep for a living, so he wasn't a riding animal. And I asked, well, what happened to the other 4 would-be buyers. And she said they treated him very badly. He wouldn't move for them at all. They declared him to be stupid. They kicked him. He just stood there like a rock. And so when I came along, and she might have been laying it on a little bit thick, but he immediately took to me, and when I did my test ride, he did everything I want him to do, which turned out to be almost a one-off, because after I started working with him.
I know I became suspicious about that too. Oh, he's cooperating, and I'm thinking, no, he's hustling you. There was just that feeling I had when I was reading that.
Yeah, he was sizing me up, and he realized that I had no ability to become the alpha in the partnership.
Right. It's funny, too, because while I was reading that, there was also something else that you didn't mention that people should become aware of. In fact, two things, and that is the first one, he was also used or basically took on a role to be a protector from things like coyotes and other wild animals. And so that's the first point I want to make.
That's
and
right.
Then the second one was that, I kind of lost my train of thought here for a little bit about this. So we'll go to the first one. About protection, because one thing that people should note is that, and I've seen this in Arizona again, wild donkeys are around when you're in certain areas. You see them, here and there, is they live alone. And typically when you see, and here's an obvious difference to me when you're out there in the wild, when you see wild horses, they're herd animals.
That's right.
And whereas a donkey isn't. And you're thinking to yourself, my goodness, here's this animal all by itself. There's predators out there, I'm sure.
Yes.
But here this donkey was a protector, and there was something unique that I guess, I couldn't remember what you call the name of these people that do this, but that horseshoe. So you had this gentleman that you wanted to actually kind of clip his hooves, and he was explaining how these animals kick. Let's go ahead and talk about why it was a protector and what makes a donkey unique when it comes to that.
Yes, and people often ask the difference in terms of personality and behavior between a donkey and a horse. And at the beginning of this, you talked about the donkeys you came across on the road, the wild donkeys. And so I'll get back to that as part of this. Horses and donkeys were both domesticated about the same time, about 6,000 years ago. The horses on the grasslands of Central Asia, Kazakhstan, I believe, is the oldest site found, and donkeys in North Africa near Egypt. And the thing is, horses are herd animals, as you pointed out, and the survival of the herd trumps the survival of the individual. So if they are threatened by, say, a pack of wild wolves or something, they may put up some resistance, but then they will take off, and they may have to leave behind a foal or an elderly or injured animal to do so. But the survival of the group is most important. The other thing I want to mention, because it's relevant, is horses do look for a leader and an alpha, as I mentioned the term earlier, and they will submit to an alpha, and a human can become that alpha. A horse will submit to a human. Okay, so here's the contrast. Donkeys are semi-solitary, a bit more like deer, and because they were in the desert, they often had to graze miles away from one another, and therefore, if there was a threat, and in that part of Africa it would be the hyenas, they had to stand their ground. They couldn't run fast enough. They didn't develop that wonderful speed that horses have. And so they would have to stand their ground against a pack of animals. And I've seen some clips from nature programs. And they may try to, put a barrier between them, and they're very agile, so they may climb up a steep rocky cliff or something to get away. But they can't outrun a predator. So they stand their ground, fight. So you have an interesting situation. The other thing I want to mention, though, is even though they're semi-solitary, unlike deer and elk and other wild animals of the same type, I mean, not the same type genetically, but the same type in terms of social organization, they will, in the wild, will avoid humans and avoid actually almost anything that's new and different. And donkeys, for whatever reason, are very curious, and they're drawn toward novelty. So walking up to your truck and hanging out and putting you on donkey time is very, very, very typical of them. They hang out at rest areas, say in Death Valley, and in New Mexico. I spent a lot of time in New Mexico, and they'll just show up and hang out and not be afraid of humans. They will, keep a little bit of a distance, but wild horses, like people have tried to film them in Mongolia, etc., they're often many, many miles away. They will not get one whiff of something different, and they're gone. And the donkeys are more likely to show up and say, "Oh, what's this?"
Right. Exactly. I remember I was watching, and also I've read about Monty Roberts, the horse whisperer,
Yes.
and he was talking about that's how he actually worked with animals like that, or deer, which are
Yes.
very similar as well,
Yes.
is that you separate them from the herd, and they will start cooperating because their survival depends on it.
Yes.
So, whereas a donkey, get out of here, I can do this on my own.
Yeah, and so they will form a partnership. They will never submit. In fact, some of the harsh forms of horse training, the term breaking always gets under my skin. It involves breaking the horse's spirit of using intimidation, negative reinforcement, punishment, spurs, whips, you name it, and harsh bridle, bits and bridles, and those methods do not work with donkeys.
Mm-hmm.
And it can create a very mean, stubborn animal if you use negative reinforcement. But if you use positive reinforcement and you kind of sell it to them like, wow, this is fun, let's cross this puddle, it sometimes works. But it will work with them. It has to be positive, I think that one of the things that Monty Roberts said, and some other horse whisperers, is that donkeys and mules must be trained the way horses should be trained. In other words, we all, dogs, humans, all respond to positive reinforcement. Mm-hmm. But donkeys are just completely resistant to negative reinforcement.
And that's so true, too. And it was funny because you were describing how you were reading about that and decided to go that direction as you first began to take lessons. I think it was in Wyoming. And there was a rather unique couple that you were involved with out there as you were beginning to learn your 6-week course on what to do and how to deal with a donkey.
That's right. And although they were, it was actually in New York State, and believe it or not, Wyoming County, New York. But anyway, they were, the two of them were quite eccentric. And I'm sorry, your question was?
Well, let's talk about what actually happened there, because you were working with positive reinforcement. That's when you were first, I believe, asked the question, did you get this to ride, or is this just going to be a big 700-pound pet?
Yeah, and of course I never quite made the decision. I wanted him, they pointed out to me that, just to get the animal from the barn to the paddock, or get a farrier to trim his hooves, or a veterinarian to give him shots, you have to have an animal that will obey most of the time. And so they wanted me to become the alpha, and even though they're the only donkey and mule trainers in New York State, and had been doing it for 50 years, they were well aware of the positive reinforcement thing. They kept insisting that I needed to be the alpha, that I needed to be the boss, and physically, you can't win a tug of war with a donkey or any other large animal. So they have to be willing to go along with you. And so I was in conflict with them because I had trouble applying, whips and things like that. I still do. And so I kept kind of undermining the training because I just couldn't really punish him. And I wanted, quite frankly, I wanted him to like me. and I was thinking initially he might be sort of like a big dog, and I'd had dogs. And so anyway, it turned out that it probably took me 4 times longer to train Caleb for ring work and for shows that we eventually got into because I really couldn't take command.
Now, things even to me got a lot more comical as you finally decided to bring Caleb home, and some of the encounters that you had with people who were owning and training horses, especially young teenage girls.
Yes, and of course all the horses at this stable, they're up to 40 or 50 donkeys and no donkeys, horses and ponies. Caleb's was and still is the only donkey. Yeah, and I'd see these little girls leading these, half draft horses around, on a loose little rein, and the horse just following them right along dutifully. Meanwhile, I'd be wrestling and dragging and begging Caleb to do what I wanted. Yes.
Now, what should people know about donkeys, first of all, that they typically don't know?
One of the things is they are very smart and independent, and only recently have there been these objective scientific studies on donkey behavior. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of studies on dogs and different breeds of dogs. There are many dozens on horses, but only recently have they, and it's mostly in Britain, have done comparative studies on donkeys and horses in the same experiments. And the horses and donkeys both have very good long-term memory, but the donkeys are really great at solving problems, such as letting themselves out of their stall, letting themselves out of their paddock, letting other horses out of their paddocks, and running around. And I think they get bored, which leads to mischief. If you have them learning new things all the time, they're just terrific. I just came back from a ride this morning, and it's 36 degrees here, very high wind, and a lot of the horses are freaking out and hard to control. And Caleb and I had a wonderful ride, both a trail ride and a ring lesson. And as you know, with a horse, you can have, if you're trying to do ring work or teaching basic dressage, a horse will go around and around and around and feel like they're getting somewhere. With a donkey, he goes one time around the ring, and the second time around, you can almost hear the cogs and wheels in his head saying, wait a minute, didn't we just do this? And he wants to do something different. And if something different means doing something that you don't want him to do, then he's probably going to do it. But if you, I can have him go through very complicated patterns and around obstacles and things like that, and he loves it.
Now, I know that you were also, as you were, I guess it was the second round of training, that you did that very thing. It was that you finally had decided, well, this Caleb just doesn't want to be doing the same thing. And so it was a situation that involved pylons. Tell us about that.
Pylons.
Where you kind of laid them out. The idea was, I guess, for him to walk in and out of these things. And after a couple of them, he was like, all right, I've had enough of this, and decided to do something a little bit different.
Oh, yeah. So we weave in and out of cones. It's really funny because that's exactly what we did this morning, but he is a bit older and more mature now. So we'd use either traffic cones or like you say, pylons, and weave in and out of them and back and forth. And Caleb would do a few, and then he'd kick one aside, and then he'd come to the end of the rope, pick up one if it was a traffic cone, pick it up, and just dash right for the fence and throw it over the fence. so he would decide to change the rules or add a creative spin on things. And one of the problems with training him is that I found myself in sympathy with him, that these endless lessons and repeats also were boring to me. And so when he did things like this, I had a lot of trouble trying not to laugh.
You know, and it was funny, too, because you said that he's older now, and that's something that people should note, too, is that during the course of his first training is that none of the information would really stick because there's a certain age that they really don't learn, and then they finally do. Why is that?
Well, that's a good question. In fact, he had a little bit of saddle training when he was 2.5 years old, but since they hadn't followed through on it, and he became a guard donkey, he taught himself other things like herding the animals and protecting them. So the donkey and mule trainers told me that the things don't really stick until they're age 8. So you can get them to do something sometimes very quickly, and you seem like you're making amazing progress, and then I don't know if they just forget or they just decide that they're irrelevant. I don't know. And I actually don't know to what extent that's true of horses, because I've never tried to train a horse. I've only ridden horses that were already trained.
I found that fascinating. Like, really, it almost sounds like humans. As kids, we just don't want to learn much of anything until after we're, 30 or 40 years old, and then finally we think we're learning. Letting things stick to us.
Yeah, and yeah, and I just don't know. I don't know the human equivalent, but I know that certain child prodigies, learning concertos on the piano can do it very, very early, but I think they have to constantly reinforce it. But I could be wrong about that.
Now, you finally had a time where your husband met Caleb. Well, tell us about that.
Yeah, Joe is a very big man and somewhat heavy-footed. He could have played football, but he didn't. But he's a big fella, and so when he was coming home after he came home from the sea, I wanted him to meet Caleb, and I told him, listen, don't walk up to him. And this is just standard advice for any large animal. It doesn't matter. But I just wanted him to be extra careful, too. I wanted them to start off on the right foot. So, don't walk up to him in a hurry. Don't stare. Just sort of look to the side. Don't do anything funny with your hands. And then, let him have a sniff first. So, anyway, we get to the barn and walk around the corner, and Joe goes over. Well, I brought Caleb out on a rope, and Joe goes around the corner. He charges up to the donkey, grabs him around the neck, and starts rubbing his knuckles up and down his nose, which in his family is called a Dutch rub, and I think most of us, at least back east, call it a noogie. So he was rubbing Caleb, and I thought, oh boy, we're going to have an explosion. And Caleb just loved it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was first, Joe has this effect on children and animals, and he did it again.
Mm-hmm. Now, Margaret, tell us, what do you feel Caleb brought to you in your life that really surprised you?
Yes. I think initially I was projecting onto him, that we were already buddies and that we understood each other, and I made a lot of mistakes in terms of not understanding or trying to understand his behavior. And then the trainers were the 2 horse trainers I went to after the initial training. Were treating him as if he was a would-be dressage pony. And the first thing I learned was donkeys are not horses, And then the second thing was that Caleb himself was not typical of a donkey, at least as what I'd read in all the books. He was definitely donkey, but he had his own particular take on life. And one of the things that he did, there's a phrase, I'm starting to hear it more and more in different contexts, but at the time people used to ask me what I meant by it, that he spoke truth to power. And I thought of the medieval jesters who were the only ones in the royal courts who were allowed to sort of make fun of the monarch. They could use satire and mimic the monarch. Sometimes they ended up losing their head anyway, but they were the only ones who were, by profession permitted to do that. And I noticed Caleb, how he would size up a trainer, and so if they were arrogant, he would just play more and more tricks on them. If they were nervous and trying hard, he'd work with them. And he just seemed to see inside people. And he certainly saw inside me that when I was trying to make him something that he wasn't, that it didn't work. But at some level, I believe that he knew how hard I was trying and that I wanted to have a relationship with him. And even if I did everything wrong at first, and I was trying the training method of the month and being inconsistent and very inconsistent, that he somehow knew I was trying and he was going to wait for me to get it right.
Right.
But anyway, so I personally related to this sort of stoicism, this quiet contemplation I saw in Caleb, and I always had trouble in my career of confronting or asserting myself, and of course I had to learn how to do a little bit of that with Caleb. But one of the things I realized that in some ways I felt undervalued the way donkeys do in life. I because I wanted to be the one who made everything work in my academic department at the college, I often ended up with the worst teaching schedules, the 8 a.m. classes, the night classes, the Saturday classes, because I was just willing to help, and I couldn't stand up and assert myself. And I think I learned from Caleb that sometimes you need to speak up, which I finally did.
I know it's pretty amazing when you're out to please others and then you try to do the same thing with something like a donkey and you realize, well, that just doesn't work that way, does it?
No, because he's thinking, well, now I can do anything I want because she wants me to like her, and therefore, as long as I'm cute about it, I can get away with murder.
Now, why was he white?
Oh yeah, he's descended from Andalusian donkeys. And this is something your listeners might be interested in, because people always ask me the difference between a burro and a donkey. And burros in the U.S. are used for the wild donkeys that you find around the western states. It's the equivalent of a Mustang, which is a wild horse. So a burro is a wild donkey. But it's a Spanish term, and it always referred to the small working animals. But the aristocracy also bred donkeys for ladies' rides and for children and for parades. And there were two of them. One is the Andalusian, which was always white, and the other was the Catalonian, which was always black. And the black ones are the ones that the King of Spain gave to George Washington as a gift. And the Andalusians are less common. But when the Spaniards came into the New World, they brought in a mixture. And so I can't say that my donkey is 100% Andalusian, but he has not only the color, because he's not an albino. His skin is actually black, but his hair is white. That he also has the shape, the horse, the long back, the particular details that make you recognize him as an Andalusian as opposed to another kind of donkey.
Wow, amazing. So you had a royal ass, in other words.
Oh, yeah, more ways than one.
You know, I was really cute, too, because in the beginning of your book, when you had first met Caleb and you were told that, well, it looks like Caleb likes you, as it's another Route 66 story, believe it or not.
Okay.
And this one actually occurred before my first one. And what had happened was, as you're along Route 66 in Arizona, of course, you'll come across these small little things that pop out in the middle of nowhere. And then this happened to be a gas station store, and it also used to be a place where apparently people took to get their cars fixed back in the day, whenever that was.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, this had been here, you could tell, forever, so it became more of a novelty. You don't get gas there anymore, although the pumps are there. You've seen some older cars sitting back here and there. And they even had in one, I guess it was a barn, which would be the auto shop itself, where they had mannequins back there, so you knew this is where you took your cars in to get fixed. Well, also out in this area, I took a lot of photos of this, but one photo op that I took, not only did I take photographs, but I also did some filming, is over in an area there was a sort of a large corral, if you will, and there was a black donkey out there all by himself. Now, he was at the far end of the corral. This is all outside, and he was all black, of all things.
Yes.
Long, shaggy hair, which I was like, I don't remember donkeys looking like this before. So, And it was funny because as I was taking photo shots and doing a little filming, he wasn't really doing anything. In fact, he was facing in the opposite direction. And somehow I think he kind of picked up the sense that I was actually giving him attention. So then all at once he brayed a couple of times. Then he came and he walked over right next to me as if to say, hey, man, what do you say we kind of connect? And, you know, and so I started patting him, and he seemed to rather enjoy that. And I thought, that was kind of funny. So, you know, when you were sharing your story, that one came to mind as well.
Yes, yes. When you say long, shaggy hair, was it winter and was it really long, or?
No, this actually, I want to take a look. When we
like
were
3 or
out
4
there,
inches.
I want to say maybe it was late spring when we were up in the area. So yeah.
Okay, yeah, because there is one French breed of donkey called the Poitou, which has really, really long wavy hair. I mean, it looks like dreadlocks, and it's always sort of a dark chocolate brown. But I think when you're talking about shaggy and hairy, he probably still had his winter coat on, which they do keep on until almost June.
Yeah, and which in Arizona, you know, the winter down here is generally about 75 degrees. So.
Yeah, except at night, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, they need that for the night.
Now, as people decide that there's a possibility they want to maybe have a donkey in their life and they want to maybe visit the Grand Canyon and use this as a guide animal, what are some things they may need to consider, keep in mind before that happens?
Yeah. If you read books by donkey owners that I read, you'd wonder why anybody would want a horse. The donkey is so smart, he's so independent, he's affectionate, blah, blah, blah. Well, all of which is true, but you need to take the time with them. It's hard to find. There are lots of miniature donkeys that became kind of a fad, and you still see them, a lot of them in petting zoos and stuff, and therapy programs. And the very big donkeys, the mammoths, are still used to breed draft mules. So you see those in the, at least in the East, you see that in the Amish and Pennsylvania Dutch. They keep a lot of really big donkeys, and also for plowing. But mechanization has replaced your big donkey mule thing, and horse. So so they're not. What we're finding is, because we want to get another the person who manages the stable where Caleb lives. We've been looking for another large saddle donkey. In fact, we were thinking we might get a black one just to contrast with Caleb. And they're actually rather hard to find. There are several thousand of them around the country. But that's not many, because there are millions, plural, of horses around. And so it's actually hard to find if you're talking about a saddle donkey big enough to ride, it's actually hard to find one. There are a lot of people who are adopting these burro and Mustang rescues done by the Bureau of Land Management out west. They have auctions, and they have donkeys, but these are wild animals. They have not been hand-raised. But to find hand-raised saddle-sized donkeys, I know some people in Tennessee, Texas, and in different states, but there are not a lot of them. So they're a little harder to find.
Wow. Yeah, I know when I was describing the donkeys I was talking about here in Arizona is, they don't tend to be super big. And I found what was also unique about the wild donkeys out in Arizona is they have sort of a light brown coat.
Yes.
But they also have stripes, not all over the body, but, kind of resembling
legs.
A zebra.
Yes, on their legs, yeah. And they're cousins, we talk about them being cousins to horses, but they're also cousins to zebras. And yes, so some of them have stripes on the legs. I've seen some recently. Some of them have many of them have the stripe going down the back with the cross over the shoulders, which some people have interpreted religiously, but is also common of wild donkeys. So they have a stripe going down right from their mane, right down their back to their tail, and then a cross stripe over their shoulders.
Now, one thing to note, too, for the listeners out there is Caleb has become quite the celebrity draw. Tell us about that.
Yes, he has. Well, a large, shaggy white donkey is pretty unusual. Most people around here have never seen a donkey at all, or a mule, because suburbs are fairly built up. And so we go to do, wherever we're asked, we go to do live nativity shows. We've done the Palm Sunday March into Jerusalem. So he's gotten quite a bit of attention on the media. Just Sunday, I had him in town. I was giving a book talk, and we brought him to meet and greet people at the door outside the library, and we drew a crowd because he is rather unusual looking.
Right. Well, yeah, he's all white.
He's all white, and he's very big.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Well, Margaret, I want to thank you for being on the program today. How can people find out more about, your book, for instance? Because I know you've also authored 2 other books as well.
Yes, that's right. I am a field geologist, and I wrote about my experiences in the very tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego and Patagonia, and also I worked in Chile for many years, and also Antarctica. And so if they'd like more information, they can look at my new website, which is www.margaretwinslow.com, and it has all 3 of the books. People ask me, well, this is a huge change to write about a donkey, but in a way they're all journeys. The one with the donkey was more of an inner journey and struggle, whereas the ones in field falling out of boats, I mean, some of the same humor, and it's just obviously the same author in all of them, but some of the same struggles to try to, be a geologist and working alone in a military dictatorship at the tip of South America.
That, and of course, a college reducing its students and trying to make more way, for independent capitalism, so to speak. So
yes.
Yeah, they'll find out all about that. Well, Margaret, thank you so much for being on the program today. It's been a real pleasure to find out a different memoir that involves a big white donkey.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure for me, too.
Thank you very much. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. You can also feel a little less stubborn if you want and move over to beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter to keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.